Okay, guys, this is our very last lesson that we'll do together. It is lesson 19, the modern art period of art history. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, and I did say this is the last video, but there may be two parts to this video. So if there are, if it takes a little bit longer, just make sure that you watch the full extent of it. Make sure we get through the whole PowerPoint. So our modern art period, um, the last thing we talked about was Impressionism, which led us into the modern art period, which is between the 1900s and present day, essentially. We're going to stop a little bit before present day. We're going to stop with pop art, but this is going to conclude our art history unit. Like I said before, if you would make sure that you are thinking about your final project while you are listening to me going over all of these different movements and consider whether or not you'd like to use these movements for your final project. If you haven't already looked at the final project instructions, I would go ahead and go to the projects folder and do that before proceeding. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started with our modern art. So as you can see, there are more periods, more movements this time than we had in our lesson 18. I'm hoping in this first part to at least get through, futurism. That's probably where we'll stop at this time. But just to kind of go through those quickly, we begin our modern art period with post-impressionism that goes on between like the 1880s and 1920s. The timeline for it is a little bit rough though. It's just kind of a guesstimate. We then move on to symbolism art that really starts as well in the 1880s and then goes into the 1910s. We have this short little blip of art called Fauvism art that only lasts 2 years. It's from 1905 to 1907. And then we have Expressionism that lasts from 1905 to 1925. We have Cubism that lasts from 1908 to 1920, roughly. We have Futurism that goes from 1908 to 1918. We have abstract art. It's actually going to include three types of art that fall within that bigger category, this big kind of general category. And then we have Dada art. And then this is our part one. There are a couple more movements as well that we will get to in part two. But I'm hoping to get through most of this part one in this video. So post-impressionism actually has a lot of the same qualities as impressionism, and you can guess it, post-impressionism comes from the original impressionism. There are just a few kind of like little nuances that we see in post-impressionism, though. Artists like Cezanne and Van Gogh became sort of frustrated with the lack of form in impressionism and countered the look with the bold black outlines, pointillism, and thick globs of paint. So they wanted to also increase their subject matter to more than just landscapes. So, our post-impressionism piece we're going to look at, this is Van Gogh's Sunflowers. And as you can see, the subject matter or what is being depicted, they want to kind of go beyond the landscapes, look at more like still lifes, portraiture, bring back the idea of like outlining things instead of having them sort of vague and fuzzy like we saw back in like the Impression sunrise painting. Kind of more definition, I guess, but still some of the same styles. It kind of giving more like a feeling of it, having like the light sort of, being interesting, sort of affecting it in different ways. A little, messy, like a little bit rushed feeling, but in a more natural looking way. And so, yeah, we have a lot of the same characteristics though. So I would, kind of look at the timeline, look at the qualities, look at the subject matter to try to differentiate between the post-impressionism period and the impressionism period. So again, artists brought back the heavy outlines and form of subject matter instead of the fuzziness from impressionist paintings. Artists continued to depict the leisurely life of the urbanite middle class. And we also look for canvases now covered with incredible numbers of tiny dots of color, known as divisionism or pointillism. So we can kind of see that even working here, these little tiny brush strokes that just are like really repetitive, almost give like the principle of repetition, it starts to become used. That's what we really want to look for here. And sometimes it goes beyond that even. It's more like actual like dots of color rather than it being like little short brush strokes. But just note that post-impressionism, unlike other art movements, is not coherent necessarily. Artists paint in different styles, which makes it tricky to pinpoint the common characteristics. So there's a lot of variety in post-impressionism. Next, we have symbolism art. It goes from 1880s to the 1910s, and it comes from in 1886. The art critic Jean Marias used the term symbolism to describe the rising trend in literature and art of representing ideas through highly metaphorical imagery. So this is something that had been going on for a very long time, as I note down here. It definitely preceded the movement for a very long time, especially art made about religion, even back in like the traditional arts of Asia and Africa. Definitely, we see, art about religion in those. However, it is not really given a name until we see it in symbolism art in the 1880s. The subject matter specifically of like what they deemed this movement was rather dark and depressing, sort of showed like pessimistic subject matter, almost sort of borrowing a little bit from the Romanticism artist. And artists that we see within this period are Gustav Klimt and Edvard Munch, who's known for the screen painting. So how do we know that symbolism art is symbolism art? We see a lot of dim and nightmarish imagery filled with mysticism, imagery depicting hauntings, mysterious figures, evil women, supernatural monsters, and demons, and imagery of death and mortality. The atmosphere almost always feels unsettling and gloomy, but everything is very meaningful. So, usually with a coherent idea that ties all of the strange symbols up into one painting. But there is like, the idea that like every little thing represents something more than just what it is. We also see sort of like this theme that carries through of the femme fatale, which is the theme or the thought that the dark and evil sister, or thought to be the dark and evil sister of the women depicted in the pre-Raphaelite art. So like in this painting that we see here, of this like angel woman being like carted off by these two boys. Just sort of like this ominous, like darker feeling than, the pretty pre-Raphaelite women that are just sort of depicted doing nice, ideal things. Our next movement is Fauvism art, and like I said, it only lasts from 1905 to 1907. It goes back to a comment made by a critic after visiting the Parisian Salon d'Automne in 1905, where bright, bold, colorful art surrounded a Renaissance artwork, to which he sarcastically remarked, Donatello au milieu des fauves, which is Donatello among the wild beast. It was never meant to be a positive term because fauves literally mean wild beast. And so these fauvism artists, that's what they were kind of known as, were like making these paintings that were very radical, very just sort of wild and crazy looking, crazy use of color, amongst all of these very like prestigious, by the book technical artworks. Henri Matisse was the leader of this movement. And we see a lot of intuitive color usage. That's something that you can kind of identify quickly. They believe that color should express the artist's feelings rather than the local color of what it actually was. And again, note the paintings themselves and their subject matter are still figurative and recognizable. We haven't arrived at abstract or like non-representational art just yet. I'm meaning abstract art because that's what that category was that we saw on the timeline, but it's still recognizable. It's just a little bit crazier, like less by the book. So Fauvism artwork, you want to look for patches and splotches of shockingly bright, intuitive color, specifically red. So intuitive color, we look back in like our color lesson that we went over a long time ago, is color that is not the natural or the local color of something. So for example, this tree here that has this like kind of blue to red transition, this is not how this tree would naturally be colored. It would be, more like browns and, like maybe like some beige colors. But the intuitive color is the artist having the freedom and like the creativity to paint it whatever color they wanted to. They they also would draw and paint with a non-naturalistic, simplified design. Sometimes in Matisse paintings, he actually just like cuts out pieces of like colored paper and then pastes them down to create sort of like a collage. So very, very flat shapes. The subject matter really varies from landscapes to portraits to genre paintings. There's not really any consistency. and what is painted, but it's just how it's painted, this very sort of like crazy, wild, intuitive look to it. Expressionism art, our next one that we're going to talk about, goes from 1905 to 1925. There is some sort of similarities between expressionism and symbolism, but they are pretty different. It's in reaction to the social changes of industrialization as well as the First World War. Artists used expressionism as an outlet for their mutual feelings of the darkness and hostility. They never usually depict beauty. That's not how they felt. And so they didn't want to depict things that looked beautiful. They wanted to express more how they were actually feeling. Like Fauvism and Impressionism, Expressionism filled the gaps for what photography was not able to do, which was to convey the feeling an artist harbored. Photography was and still is deceptive because it can only show the way that something actually exists, not the feelings and emotions attached to it. So let's look at some artwork from the Expressionist period. We see a lot of distorted or exaggerated imagery. The scenes show a modern world which is hostile and alienating. Aggressive and raw brushstrokes are often seen as well. There's no imagery of beauty depicted typically. People seem sickly or in emotional pain or anguish. The Expressionist art is similar to Symbolist art. The scenes are eerie or nightmarish, but you can tell them apart. Expressionist perspective is similar to people and objects is just or expressionist perspective similar to people and objects is distorted, and also the shapes and forms usually lack much detail to them, a little bit like the Fauvism, really. Okay. Our next one is Cubism art. I know we're kind of moving through these quickly, but I just don't want to make this video an hour long. So Cubism art goes from 1908 to 1920. The artists Picasso, and Baroque were the founders of Cubism after Picasso showed Les Dames d'Avignon, or Young Ladies of Avignon. I've gone on a couple kind of conversations about the Picasso work, but Cubism, I feel, is something that was needed for sure. We needed a change. We needed a new type of artwork to be made. However, the approach to making this type of artwork, I don't think is the most morally ethical. So we know Picasso was a Spanish artist. He went to Africa to do studies and, to see kind of how they were making artwork. And it was very much like Cubism artwork. And so this was sort of a borrowed tradition of how people make artwork. And Picasso and Baroque sort of claiming it as their own. But this is a type of art, the look to it, the style of it had existed for, centuries, really, just not in the Western art culture. So perhaps the reason is the generations that preceded them had already covered so much ground, experiments with light, like in Impressionism, color and in Fauvism, and texture with Expressionism. So much had already been done, and certainly artists were not willing to go back to perfectly representational art of the Renaissance and the Baroque eras. That comes from identifythisart.com. But yeah, it was just seeking something more than what had been created already. There are two types of cubism as far as the stylistic look to it. We see analytical cubism as being paintings that are composed of little cubes and other geometric shapes. Objects are deconstructed and analyzed from different angles and turned into fragmented compositions. That explains why the first of the two phases of cubism was called analytical cubism. So we would see these cubist paintings as being sort of, if you've ever seen the Inside Out movie where they like go through the tunnel and they start like simplifying like more and more from like the 3D characters to the like more 2D characters that are just like the shapes. That's sort of what analytical cubism was. It was like reducing and simplifying things down to like their more basic shapes and forms. That on top of wanting to sort of overlap, different angles, different sort of perspectives of the same subject, all on top of one another. So yeah, a few approaches are going on here, but it's fairly like traditional cubism. It's like kind of what you think of when you think about cubist art. We also have synthetic cubism, and synthetic cubism is way less concerned with representation of the subject and is more with the use of various materials, textures, and colors. So like these are very early collage artists. Analytical cubism is intellectual, while synthetic cubism is playful. And they're just sort of, getting materials and like, different scraps of paper and cardboard and things like that and collaging them together. Yeah, and just kind of having fun, not having like necessarily something that they have to be this clean cut image like the analytical cubism was. It was more playful, light, experimental. Okay, this is probably our last one we'll cover in this video. It's Futurism art, and it goes from 1908 to 1918. Futurism art is the ideas were laid out by the Italian writer and poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti in his manifesto. He endorsed a new way of life, which is modernity in all its forms. Speed, violence, machinery. He was praised for automobiles, trains, and planes. And these ideas resonated among the younger men specifically, eager to modernize Italy. So as we sort of like, are moving more into this modern world, we see like things start to speed up. We see cars, we see trains, planes, we see, things are just happening like quickly, quickly, quickly over and over again. And so this futurism art was sort of embodying those ideas. So how do we know that it is coming from futurism? Objects are going to be captured in motion, represented with repeated parallel lines and spirals to convey dynamicism. And so, in fact, repetition, blurring, and lines of force, which are used to this day as techniques to convey a sense of movement, were convinced or conceived by the futurist. Subject matters such as cars, steamships, trains, steel towers, and urban construction. And there's just this feeling, this celebration of the industrial landscape in modernity. So I have this cute little painting over here of this person walking their little dachshund, and that those lines, those repetitive parallel lines and spirals to convey or to allude to this motion happening. That is something that you see a lot in futurism. And sometimes you'll see something like the body of the dog and like, well, not so much in the person, but the body and the head of the dog, they're sort of like, one compact thing where the legs that are moving and creating this motion, that's the part that's more blurred and, kind of show this motion. And then even beyond that, we see these like really intense parallel diagonal lines that make it feel like we're moving, through the space as well. But futurism is the subject matter. You're going to see a lot of cars, a lot of trains, a lot of like, modern ways of transportation. So this one kind of has some specific subject matter. It may be good for your project if you have interest in any of those things for your theme. But yeah, we're going to stop here. And then in our next part to this video, we're going to talk about abstract art. And there's 3 different types of abstract art that we'll talk about. But come back to that part and we will finish everything up.